What is the ultimate purpose of life? Is it happiness? If so, then what is happiness? Are you happy when you build things or when you think deeply about them? What makes a human life truly good? And why do most people start with the wrong question? And how does that apply to community? Almost 2,500 years ago, one man in ancient Greece struggled with these same problems. And today I'm going to share the answers he came up with. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Aristotle's Politics. Today we are jumping into Book 7. Here, Aristotle dives into the messy territory of ethics. This part really feels like taking a break from politics and going back to basics, human nature, and major ethical disagreements. Aristotle does something annoying and brilliant here. Book begins with a trap. Aristotle makes you think you are talking about politics, but suddenly you are knee deep in ethics. He says, let's slow down. If you want to design the best community, first figure out how a person should live. In other words, if you don't know what a human being is for, good luck deciding what a city is for. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a review as this helps show to reach more people. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. And my friends, I have recently secured some podcast conversations on topics about extraterrestrial life, aliens, history, gladiators, consciousness, ancient Rome, and many more. Basically, the full buffet of human confusion. But for now, let's go back 2,500 years ago and sit with our famous ancient Greek guy, Aristotle, again. Before we start discussing the best regime, you must first understand what is the best way of living one's life, given the reasonable expectations. Aristotle says that before we decide this, we will always be unclear about the best way to organize communities. If you skip this step, the whole political project becomes guesswork. Even plenty of modern debates are basically people disagreeing about what a good human life even is. Now, the argument here is that no one would make a claim that a person's life is blessed if they lack courage, if they get distressed over little things, if they cannot control themselves, or if they betray their friends, or if they cannot control their own emotions. So people disagree about many things, but almost nobody praises a life built on vice. But then comes a twist, according to Aristotle. People disagree over how much each type of these considerations is desirable, and to what degree and why. So there is an argument over the first principles, agreement over the first principles, but then there are disputes over the practicalities. Another important problem is how can someone balance these things with external goods like money, reputation, beauty, family background, and so on. So what is preferable life given this reality? Is happiness about the accumulation of external goods, or is it about inner peace, or both? And if both, how do you balance them? What is the preferable life? The life stuffed with external goods, or the life grounded in virtue, inner character, stable dispositions? The answer is that it is better to have virtue in abundance and external goods in moderation than to have external goods in abundance and virtue in deficiency. He even gives us a simple mental formula. External goods are limited. Virtue is, in principle, unlimited. External goods have a limit, but with regards to one's character and sharpness of mind, there is really no limit on how much virtuous you can become. You can always aim to improve yourself. Regarding external goods, you need enough, but after a certain point, the more becomes pointless. If you apply this idea to the real life, the idea is that you would be equally happy, for example, if you had $100 million versus $100 billion, if we applied Aristotle's logic to the modern times. Virtue is unlimited in a sense that you can always perfect it with practice and daily habits. At some point, the numbers stop mattering, but your character, your clarity of mind, your courage, your honesty, those can always deepen. So there is no ceiling on becoming wiser or more disciplined. Sky is the only limit. Now, applying this to the community, Aristotle argues that the city aimed at external goods becomes unstable and dependent, but the city aimed at virtue is self sufficient and self reliant. He even pulls in a divine analogy here. God, as Aristotle sees it, doesn't rely on external things. God is self sufficient through virtue and activity. So the closer our lives resemble that kind of self sufficiency, the closer we get to real happiness. He doesn't mean God in the modern religious sense. He means the ideal of a perfect being, a complete being whose goodness depends on nothing outside itself. Then Aristotle makes an observation regarding the difference between good fortune and happiness. External things come from fortune, but virtue comes from choice. That's the main argument here. The cause of external things is chance or fortune, such as having health, having more friends, having good parents or good looks. These things are mostly outside one's control, and they are external causes. They are there by chance or fortune, but no one would be called just, moderate, truthful, or courageous by chance or fortune. So external things are not up to us, but choosing to be just, moderate, courageous, and truthful is fully within our choice all the time throughout our lives. So even if you cannot control how good looking you are, you can control how courageous you are. This is very similar to Stoicism, but the difference here is that Aristotle accepts that external things are necessary, but they're not the most important thing in life. Whereas Stoic would say that virtue is the only thing that matters. Forget about external goods. Aristotle ends this part by saying that we will return to this topic another time. So I think Aristotle is probably telling this to his students that the class is politics and not ethics. And what we need to take away from this is that the best way of life, both for individuals and communities, is the one linked to virtue, meaning being able to take actions and make decisions that accord with specific virtues on the things that are within our control. So we started this section by inquiring that before we talk about regimes, we must first identify what is the best way of life. And he says that the best way of life is the one linked to virtuous life. Okay, quick summary of this chapter. Before defining the best way to organize communities, we need to define the best life for individuals. The best life for both individuals and communities is the life according to virtue. External goods and virtue are both important for a happy life, but virtue is more important than external goods since it is within our control. So we discussed individual virtues or happiness of the individuals. Now, what happens when we apply this logic to a city? So that's the question of chapter 2. Aristotle says that what happiness means for the individual or community is obviously the same, even though they are often regarded as different. Because if we accept that wealth is the ultimate goal in life, then both the richest person and the richest city is the happiest. Whereas if you think that virtue is the most important aim in life, you can make the same argument for both the individual and the community, that being courageous, both as an individual and as a collection of individuals, is important. Then Aristotle goes into one of the oldest human dilemmas. And honestly, this is one of the parts of Aristotle's politics that I think aged terribly well. And I think it is still relevant to this day. I think it will be relevant as long as the human nature stays the same as it is. So the question is the active civic life better or the philosophical life is better? You can also frame it in different ways. Being an active citizen versus dedicating your life to philosophy or science. So, do you spend your days engaged in politics, public life, decision making, or do you devote yourself to contemplation, science, philosophy, understanding the meaning of life, meaning of universe? Which is more choice worthy in life? Being engaged in politics and being an active citizen or acting like a bystander? Being an active participant of the community or devoting your life to science and philosophy, for example. Political life versus philosophic life. We are told in the text that it is obvious that those two ways of life require some active agency on the part of the individual to attain virtue, because no one passively chooses to be an active citizen or philosopher. They do it by actively choosing this way of life, this specific way of life. So nobody accidentally becomes an engaged citizen or accidentally becomes a scientist or accidentally discovers quantum physics. So if they are conducted properly, both philosophical life and civic life aim at virtue, and therefore Aristotle says both are virtues. This point is very important because he's preparing the argument in later chapters that the best citizens are virtuous citizens, and a good regime supports both civic excellence and contemplation. Aristotle says that there are a lot of discussions around this topic among philosophers. Some people claim that sometimes politics involve making hard choices, especially during wars, and whether they wish it or not, sometimes they have to exercise some sort of power over others and act as kind of a master. And interestingly enough, only in politics, Aristotle says, we see this type of tendency. For example, doctors or the pilot of the ship just do their jobs. They do not care about compelling others to do what they wish. Aristotle says that this is fine, and that this misunderstanding among philosophers happens because some people confuse mastery with political rule. Philosophers accuse politicians of being despotic, master like. But Aristotle says, no, that is a misunderstanding. True political life, true political rule is not simply mastery over others. So he is not endorsing mastering free citizens. Aristotle is basically saying that politics should not be about the exercise of power for the sake of exercising power. It is about ruling and being ruled in turn among the equals. So ultimately, he rejects this idea that the best life should be the one avoiding active civic duties. Aristotle says that defense of the city and the pursuits of politicians, certain pursuits of politicians, such as war, can be fine, but that is not the highest aim of the city. The highest aim of the legislator or governor, Aristotle says, is to see how a city, which is a stock of human beings, will share in the good life and in the happiness to the extent that it is possible in practice. So it is up to a great legislator or governor to see when they should be dealing with war or education or other matters. But ultimately, war is not the highest aim of the community. It is only necessary, Aristotle says, if the country is invaded or anything similar. The ultimate purpose of politics is to create conditions for virtue, and contemplation. And that requires peace and leisure, not constantly being involved in a war. Here we actually see why Aristotle, despite admiring certain traits of Spartan society, he does not fully endorse it, unlike Plato. He criticizes Sparta because it trains citizens for one virtue only, which is courage. It treats war as the purpose, not the tool, or as an end in itself, and not as a means to something more noble. It lacks the proper cultivation of moral and intellectual virtues. It doesn't aim at the comprehensive good life, only survival and domination. So, quick summary of chapter 2. Active civic life and philosophical/scientific life both require active choice, and thus are virtuous activities by definition when they are done right. War is not the highest aim of community. War is for the sake of peace. Peace is for the sake of living well. Living well means living virtuously, and living virtuously requires making active choices in life regarding the type of character you want to cultivate. So that's all about chapter 2. In chapter 3, Aristotle is still addressing the debate between political life versus contemplative life among those who agree that virtue is the highest good. The argument presented here is that even if most people agree that the most choice-worthy pursuit in life is living life in accordance with virtue, they will disagree regarding the practice of it. Not a surprise, because we all know that if there is one thing that humans like to do, that is disagreeing over things, especially if they are very smart. Some say getting engaged in politics is not compatible with virtuous life, since you need to compel others to do things that they don't want to do, and that is more like a mastery. Others will say that no, actually, active civic life is the ultimate representation of virtue seeking, as you are trying to improve the life of the community and not just your own individual life. And to achieve this end, sometimes you have to compel others to do things they don't want to do. So you can imagine two camps here. Camp A says the life of moral virtue is political life. Camp B says no, the life of moral virtue cannot be political life. Publicly active life versus intellectual life. Aristotle says that both are right and wrong. Both camps are right and wrong depending on circumstances. The reality depends on what kind of rule you are talking about. Of course, he says there is nothing noble about giving commands for the sake of giving commands, compelling others for the sake of having power over others, if it doesn't improve the community's life in the end. But Aristotle also says that it is incorrect, therefore, to confuse every sort of political rule with mastery or forcing others to do things. He says that political rule is about ruling over free individuals. So here you are mostly concerned about what is best for the individuals. You are not using them as means to get power. You are treating them as ends in themselves. Of course, this does not happen all the time in practice, but this is what should be ideally in Aristotelian understanding of politics. Also, in the same way that there is nothing noble about ruling in itself, there is also nothing noble about being passive and avoiding action. The life of happiness is a positive pursuit. It requires action. It requires agency. If you want to be a just person, for example, you have to act justly. It cannot happen randomly. You have to do just acts. If you want to be a truthful person, you have to tell the truth. So pursuing virtue in itself is an action-oriented endeavor by definition. Therefore, best way of life for both individuals and communities is the active way of life rather than passivity, according to Aristotle. Important to note here is that Aristotle is not saying political life is the best life. He's defending activity, not necessarily politics. And he is criticizing passivity. The philosophical or intellectual or scientific life, when done right, is also an active life for Aristotle. It is not some solitary activity that you do in your room, in your lab, because it involves teaching others, debating others, presenting ideas, applying those ideas in practice, and so on. So the conclusion is that both intellectual and active public life are virtues and active when they are done right. They do not contradict each other. Quick summary: happiness is activity, not passivity. Virtue requires action. Ruling is not noble by itself. It becomes noble only if it is for the sake of the common good. So this chapter is not Aristotle choosing politics. He's eliminating the false argument that contemplation or intellectual life or philosophical life is passive. In chapter 4, Aristotle says that to create the best community, one should carefully consider what equipment and tools are there in terms of the people, territory, culture, and land. To be a great city and the most populous one is not the same thing, Aristotle says. It might be the case that one or few individuals carry the community forward in terms of virtue and happy life, rather than the majority. So Aristotle's main argument here is that quantity does not equal quality, especially when it comes to human beings. If a city becomes too populous, it becomes very difficult to manage. More people means more need for coordination. Think of it this way: too many people means too much complexity, too many coordination problems, and potentially order might break down because of it. Too few people means you don't have the diversity of skills needed for self-sufficiency. If you remember the first episode of Aristotle's Politics, this series, we define the city as something that is self-sufficient in itself. People gather into cities for the sake of self-sufficiency and for virtuous life. I cannot make shoes, but I can make breads. If I am living alone in the wilderness, and the only thing I am good at in life is making shoes, then I will suffer and will not be self-sufficient. But if I organize into cities with other fellow human beings who might be good at different skills, which I might lack, then I will be self-sufficient. And that is the purpose why these cities got established in the first place, rather than everyone living on their own. One famous line to return to from book 1 is that's very related to this idea is that if you do not need a community, then you are either a beast or a god. So a city must be large enough to be self-sufficient, but not overly complex that it becomes insanely difficult to preserve order. Citizens must be familiar with other citizens in terms of their qualities. Aristotle also contrasts polis, which is city, versus ethnos, which is a population group, versus oklos, which is just a mob or crowd. If people share no common principles and no common aim, they are not a city at all. They're just an ethnos, or a chaotic crowd. Final principle, according to Aristotle, is that the best defining principle is that city size must be balanced. large enough for self sufficiency, small enough for governability. Quick summary: a city is defined by constitution, not by population size. Oversized populations create coordination problems and might diminish order. Undersized populations lack functional diversity, skills, crafts, and services. The compromise lies on striking a balance where the city is large enough for self sufficiency and small enough for governability. A city is defined by its aim at self sufficiency rather than brute aggregation of individuals. In chapter 5, Aristotle says that the same rule applies to territory as well. The territory should be large enough for citizens to live comfortably, but not too large that results in citizens being scattered and not being able to recognize one another and have some shared civic virtues. It is also important for cities to trade with other cities, to import what is lacking and export what is in surplus. But the city should be involved in trade for its own interests only. Having access to the sea has both advantages and disadvantages. Advantage is that it can trade with other cities via ships. But having sea access also leaves the city a bit vulnerable for invaders. Now, Aristotle gets interesting and a bit controversial in chapter 7. He claims that climate shapes people's character. He says that people in cold locations, particularly in Europe, have courage and spirit, but they are not so good with culture and sciences. In a sense, he is saying that northern peoples are spirited and courageous, and as a result, they value freedom, so they are relatively free, but because they lack deliberative culture, they fail at city building, long term organization, laws, arts, and refined crafts. He says, on the other hand, that people that live in warm climates, such as in Asia, have rich culture, intellect, and craftsmanship, but they are not so courageous, and therefore they often end up getting ruled by other nations. He says that Greeks, his own people, share both traits. They are half European and half Asian. So he places ancient Greeks in the middle, possessing the balanced combination needed for political excellence. He says Greeks are successful in colonizing the entire Mediterranean because they are good at arts, sciences, political thought, but they're also resilient and have spiritedness and courageous. So this is Aristotle's justification for why ancient Greek cities achieved political excellence in the ancient world. Aristotle is essentially saying that cold climates result in stronger spiritedness, warm climates result in stronger intelligence and craftsmanship. Middle climates have the mixture of both. Of course, please take these observations with a grain of salt. I'm not claiming that this is the reality or the case, but this is how Aristotle saw it. And keep in mind that this man lived almost 2,500 years ago. When Aristotle says Europe and Asia, or Europeans or Asians, he's talking about the ancient Greek map of the world, not the modern concepts we have today. But the broader point still stands. Environment shapes culture, and culture shapes all the different possibilities. Such an interesting observation. I wonder whether Aristotle would be surprised to find out how dynamics changed in the future. It also shows that sometimes people that progress come from places that you least expect. Aristotle then also says that having affection and sympathy towards one's people always elevates the cities. If you are in the city and you go out and see a stranger, and if you can trust that person, or let's say that if that person needs help and you genuinely want to help, that shows that the city is healthy. In other words, civic friendship is what keeps people together in Aristotelian theory of politics. Quick summary: of this chapter, climate shapes character of people. Cities need internal unity grounded in civic friendship. A healthy city produces citizens who see one another as partners in a shared good, not isolated individuals. In chapter 8, Aristotle argues that the best city must have a territory that is large enough to provide everything necessary for the good life, but not so large that it becomes impossible to defend or administer. An ideal city should be positioned far enough inland to avoid constant naval raids, but close enough to the city to have access to trade and communication, yet not so close that the city becomes morally corrupted by excessive commercial influence. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can find this show on all major platforms. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And if you missed the earlier episodes, go check out earlier episodes as well, because the concepts and theories that I have covered here builds upon the discussions that we've had in the previous chapters. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory, with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, Stephen Hicks on enlightenment, Spencer Greenberg on rationality, and Anil Seth on consciousness. Check them out if you're interested. Until next time, bye.